Before the smoke rose, before the ground split open, before the sky itself became a weapon, there existed two cities so consumed by their own darkness that the cry rising from them reached the very throne of heaven. And what came down in response was not a warning. It was not a final negotiation. What came down was fire. And nothing, not a wall, not a gate, not a king's decree, not the accumulated pride of two of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world, nothing survived it. This is not folklore. This is not the exaggerated memory of a primitive people trying to explain a natural disaster they did not understand. This is the account recorded in the book of Genesis, the oldest, most carefully preserved sacred narrative in human history. And what it describes in the plains of the Jordan, on a day that began like any other day, is an event so total, so absolute, so theologically precise in its execution, that it has never stopped demanding an answer to the question it raises. What does it take for God to destroy a city? The story does not begin with fire. It begins with a man sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham, the patriarch, the father of nations, the man to whom God had made a covenant so vast it encompassed not just his own descendants, but every family on the face of the earth, Genesis 12 verse 3, was sitting at the door of his tent by the oaks of Mamre when he looked up and saw three men standing before him. Genesis 18 verses 1 to 2. The text opens with a detail that sets the theological tone for everything that follows. It tells us, before Abraham sees the visitors, that the Lord appeared to him. The visitors and the divine presence are connected from the first breath of the narrative. Abraham's response to these three strangers is immediate and extravagant. He ran to meet them. He bowed to the ground. He called himself their servant. He urged them not to pass by, asked them to rest, to wash their feet, to eat. And then he rushed, Scripture uses that word deliberately, rushed, to Sarah's tent, to the herd, to the young man who prepared the meal. Genesis 18 verses 6 to 7, a tender calf, fine flour, curds and milk. A feast prepared with the urgency of a man who understood, on some level that perhaps exceeded conscious thought, that what was standing outside his tent was worthy of his very best. They ate, and then one of them spoke. Where is Sarah thy wife? Genesis 18 verse 9. The question is precise. Not, do you have a wife? Not, what is her name? Where is she? A question that already knows the answer, asked not for information, but for what it is about to reveal. And what it revealed broke open a promise that Abraham and Sarah had been carrying for decades, the promise of a son, made to a couple who were now far beyond the age where such a promise seemed physically possible. I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. Genesis 18 verse 10. Sarah was listening at the tent door, and she laughed. Not a laugh of joy, not yet. A laugh of disbelief. The quiet, private, involuntary laugh of a woman who has hoped for so long that hope itself has become a kind of pain. She was old. Abraham was old. It ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Genesis 18 verse 11. The text is plain about the biological reality. What was being promised defied it entirely. But the visitor heard the laugh that was not meant to be heard. And the question that followed has echoed across every century since. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Genesis 18 verse 14. Is anything too hard? It is the question beneath the question of the entire narrative that is about to unfold. Because what comes next will test that question not with the promise of new life, but with the announcement of total destruction. And Abraham, standing before these visitors in the afternoon light of Mamre, is about to be drawn into one of the most extraordinary conversations recorded in all of sacred Scripture. The men rose to leave. They looked toward Sodom. And God, for the text now speaks plainly about who Abraham is standing before, made a decision that reveals something profound about the nature of divine relationship with those he has chosen. Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do? Genesis 18 verse 17. Shall I hide it? The question God asks about Abraham is the question of intimacy, of covenant, of the particular kind of relationship in which one party does not act without speaking to the other first. God had made Abraham a promise about the future of the world, and now, before executing a judgment that would reshape the landscape of that future, he chose to speak, to invite Abraham not merely into the knowledge of what was coming, but into the conversation about it. What Abraham was about to hear would test everything he understood about the God he had followed out of Ur, across the wilderness, into a covenant that had cost him more than any human accounting could measure. And how he responded would reveal something about the heart of biblical faith that has never stopped being relevant. The words came plainly, without softening, without diplomatic preparation. Because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me, and if not, I will know. Genesis 18 verses 20 to 21. The cry of Sodom. Not the reputation of Sodom, not the reports about Sodom. The cry. The same word used in Exodus to describe the cry of the enslaved Israelites rising to God from their bondage in Egypt. A cry implies suffering. It implies victims. It implies that within those prosperous, powerful, celebrated cities, something was happening to people. Real people, vulnerable people, whose pain had accumulated until it rose past every earthly ceiling and arrived, unbearable and undeniable, before the throne of heaven itself. And heaven was responding. Abraham stood still, and then, in a moment that has defined the theology of intercessory prayer for every tradition that has carried this story forward, he drew near, not away, near. And Abraham drew near, and said, Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Genesis 18 verse 23. The question was not a challenge to divine authority. It was the question of a man who knew God well enough to appeal to his own nature. Abraham did not argue that Sodom deserved to survive. He argued that God's justice could not destroy the innocent alongside the guilty. And he was right, because the God he was speaking to was the same God whose justice was the very foundation of the judgment about to fall. The negotiation that followed is unlike anything else in sacred literature. 50 righteous people. Would God spare the city for 50? Yes. Genesis 18 verse 26. 45? Yes. Genesis 18 verse 28, 40? Yes. Genesis 18 verse 29, 30? Yes. Genesis 18 verse 30, 20? Yes. Genesis 18 verse 31, 10? I will not destroy it for 10's sake. Genesis 18 verse 32. 10 righteous people. That was all. 10 people living in integrity within those city walls would have been enough to hold back the fire. The negotiation ended. God departed, and Abraham returned to his place. But in Sodom, the sun was already moving toward evening, and 2 angels were walking through the gate. The angels arrived at evening. Scripture is precise about the timing. And there came 2 angels to Sodom at even. Genesis 19 verse 1. Evening, that threshold hour between the light and the dark, when the character of a city reveals itself most honestly. When the structures of daytime respectability give way to what a place truly is, when the sun no longer watches. And Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom. This detail carries weight that biblical scholars have long noted. The gate of an ancient city was not merely an entrance point. It was the center of civic life, the place where elders sat, where disputes were settled, where the business of the community was conducted in the open air of public accountability. That Lot sat at the gate suggests he had established himself within Sodom's social structure. He was not a stranger passing through. He was a resident, a participant, a man who had chosen, years before, when Abraham had offered him first choice of the land, to lift his eyes toward the Jordan Valley, toward Sodom, because it was well-watered, because it was prosperous, because it looked, from a distance, like everything a man could want. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well-watered everywhere. Genesis 13 verse 10. It had looked like Eden, and he had walked toward it. Now he sat at its gate, and when he saw the 2 visitors, these same angels who had eaten with Abraham at Mamre, he rose. He bowed his face to the ground, and he urged them, with a persistence that mirrors his uncle Abraham's hospitality, to come to his house, to wash their feet, to spend the night. Genesis 19 verses 2 to 3. The angels initially declined. They said they would spend the night in the street. But Lot pressed them, strongly, as though he understood, perhaps from years of living within those walls, from whatever he had witnessed across whatever length of time he had called this city home, that the street was not safe. That whatever these strangers might encounter in the open air of Sodom after dark was something he could not allow to happen to guests who had come under his sight. They came inside. Lot prepared a feast. Unleavened bread. Genesis 19 verse 3. And for a moment, just a moment, the narrative breathes. A man and his guests, inside a house, with food and shelter. The ordinary architecture of human hospitality, constructed inside a city that was about to demonstrate precisely why it could not be saved. Then the night arrived, and Sodom showed its face. But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. Genesis 19 verse 4. All the people, from every quarter, old and young. The totality of the description is not incidental. Scripture is making a precise theological point. This was not a faction within Sodom. This was not a criminal element operating on the margins of an otherwise decent community. This was the city itself, its full population, across every generation, surrounding one man's house in the dark with a collective intent that stripped away any remaining ambiguity about the nature of what had made Sodom's cry rise to heaven. They demanded the visitors be brought out. Genesis 19 verse 5. Lot went outside. He shut the door behind him. And what he did next is one of the most painful and complicated moments in the entire patriarchal narrative. Painful precisely because it reveals a man caught between genuine courage and the profound moral distortion that results from too many years of accommodation to a culture that has normalized the unacceptable. He appealed to the crowd. He called them brothers. He begged them not to act wickedly. Genesis 19 verse 7. And then, in a desperate, horrifying attempt to redirect their violence, he offered his own daughters. Genesis 19 verse 8. Scripture records this without softening it, without excusing it, without inserting a divine interruption that prevents Lot from finishing the sentence. The text allows the full, uncomfortable weight of what he said to stand. Because the Bible does not present its human figures as flawless. It presents them as people, shaped by their choices, marked by their compromises, capable of both genuine courage and devastating moral failure in the same breath. The crowd was not moved by Lot's appeal. They pressed harder. They accused him of setting himself up as a judge, this stranger who had come to live among them, and they threatened to do worse to him than to his guests. Genesis 19 verse 9, they surged toward the door, and then the angels acted. But the men put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them, and shut to the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves to find the door. Genesis 19 verses 10 to 11. Blindness. Sudden, complete, disorienting blindness, falling on every man outside that door simultaneously. And what Scripture records in the aftermath of that blindness is perhaps the most chilling detail in the entire account. They wearied themselves trying to find the door, even blind. Even unable to see. They did not stop. They did not scatter in fear. They did not reconsider. They kept reaching for the door of the house where they believed the visitors were held, exhausting themselves in the darkness trying to reach what they had come for. This is the detail that answers Abraham's question before it needed to be asked. Were there 10 righteous people in Sodom? The entire city, old and young, from every quarter, was outside that door, blind and still reaching. There were not 10. Inside the house, the angels turned to Lot with the urgency of men on a schedule that would not be adjusted. Hast thou here any besides? Son-in-law, and thy sons, and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will destroy this place. Genesis 19 verses 12 to 13. The announcement was not a warning to be weighed. It was a departure deadline. The destruction was not conditional any longer. It was not subject to further negotiation. Abraham had already conducted that negotiation at Mamre, and the count had come up short. What the angels were now offering Lot was not a reprieve for the city. It was a rescue for his family. Lot went to his sons-in-law. The men pledged to marry his daughters. He told them to rise and leave, that the Lord was about to destroy the city. Genesis 19 verse 14. And they laughed at him. Not the laugh of Sarah, the involuntary, private laugh of a woman processing an impossible promise. This was the laugh of men who had heard the words and found them absurd. He seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. Genesis 19 verse 14. A man who had lived in Sodom long enough to sit at its gate, whose future sons-in-law were so thoroughly embedded in its culture that the announcement of divine judgment sounded to them like a joke. This was the harvest of years of accommodation. Lot's words carried no weight in Sodom because Lot's life had not been sufficiently distinct from Sodom to make his voice credible when it mattered most. They stayed, and dawn was coming. The angels grew urgent. Arise, take thy wife, and thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. Genesis 19 verse 15. And then Scripture records a detail of such raw, honest human psychology that it has resonated with readers across every century since it was written. Lot lingered, standing at the threshold of a city God was about to destroy, with the angels of heaven physically present in his house, with the deadlines spoken aloud, with the blindness of the crowd outside still demonstrating the reality of divine power. Lot lingered. Genesis 19 verse 16. He hesitated, at the edge of his own deliverance. Perhaps it was the life he had built there, the years, the investments, the social position that came with sitting at the gate of a prosperous city. Perhaps it was simply the paralysis that descends on human beings when everything familiar, even a familiar that has long since curdled into something dangerous, is about to be permanently removed. Perhaps it was grief. Even for a place that deserved judgment, leaving is still leaving. But the angels did not wait for Lot to overcome his hesitation through his own resolve. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him. And they brought him forth, and set him without the city. Genesis 19 verse 16. The Lord being merciful unto him. Lot did not save himself. He was pulled, carried, physically extracted from the place his feet could not leave voluntarily. And the text names this not as divine impatience or compulsion, but as mercy. The mercy that reaches into human hesitation and moves what human will cannot move in time. They were outside the city now. The sky above Sodom was still dark, but not for long. The angels spoke their final instruction. Escape for thy life, look not behind thee, neither stay thou in all the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest thou be consumed. Genesis 19 verse 17. Do not look behind you. It was the simplest possible instruction. 3 words that required nothing except the sustained direction of a man's face toward what lay ahead rather than what lay behind. 3 words that would prove, before the morning was over, to be the difference between life and death. The sun was rising over the land. Lot was entering the small city of Zor, and in the plains behind him, something was descending from the sky that had no precedent in human experience. The fire was coming. The sun had fully risen over the earth, and then the sky broke open. Scripture records the moment with the directness of an eyewitness account that requires no elaboration to produce its full effect. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Genesis 19 verse 24, brimstone and fire. From the Lord out of heaven. The repetition of the divine name, the Lord reigned, from the Lord out of heaven, is not accidental. It is theological emphasis. A statement that what was falling on those cities was not a natural disaster that happened to coincide with a divine warning. It was directed, intentional, precisely targeted. An act of judgment executed with the full, conscious, sovereign authority of the God who had first heard the cry rising from those plains and had come down to see. 2 cities. The plain. Everything that grew from the ground. Everyone who lived there. Everything. Genesis 19 verse 25. Gone. The word that Scripture uses to describe what happened to those cities, overthrown, carries within it the sense of something turned completely upside down. Not damaged. Not partially destroyed. Not left as ruins that future generations might excavate and study. Overthrown. The physical landscape itself was transformed. What had been, in living memory, a region so fertile and well-watered that Lot had compared it to the garden of the Lord, Genesis 13 verse 10. That same region was now something no subsequent traveler would describe in those terms. Biblical scholars widely note that the geography of the region around the southern end of the Dead Sea bears striking testimony to an ancient catastrophe of significant magnitude. The area known in antiquity as the cities of the plain sits in one of the most geologically volatile regions on Earth, part of the Great Rift Valley, where the African and Arabian tectonic plates meet, where sulfur deposits exist naturally in the subsurface, where the conditions for precisely the kind of catastrophic event described in Genesis are written into the geology of the land itself. The Bible does not require a natural explanation to validate its account, but it is worth noting that the earth itself, in this particular location, carries the memory of something that matches the description in ways that have fascinated geologists and archaeologists alike. But in the narrative, in the sacred account that has carried this story across 4,000 years, the focus is not on the geology. The focus is on the people, and on one woman who looked back. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19 verse 26. 3 words in the original Hebrew. She looked back, and she was no more. This is one of the most discussed, most debated, most theologically rich details in the entire account. What does it mean that she looked back? Was it simple disobedience, the violation of a clear, explicit, direct instruction from divine messengers? Was it grief, the involuntary turning of a mother's face toward the city where her daughter's husbands remained, toward the life she had built across however many years Sodom had been her home? Was it longing, that most human of impulses, the desire to see one more time what is being permanently left behind? Scripture does not tell us what was in her heart when she turned. It tells us only what she did and what followed. The instruction had been unambiguous. Do not look behind you. The angels had not explained the reason. They had not offered a theological justification for the restriction. They had simply stated it, with the urgency of messengers who knew exactly what was descending on that plain and exactly how little time remained for those fleeing it. She looked, and the fire that was consuming everything she had turned to see consumed her too, though in a different form. A pillar of salt, standing in the plain, a monument to the moment a woman could not release what God had already condemned. Centuries later, Jesus would reference this moment in a single, stark sentence that carries all of its original weight without requiring elaboration. Remember Lot's wife. Luke 17 verse 32, just 3 words. No explanation. No commentary. The story itself was commentary enough. Remember the woman who was rescued from destruction and turned back toward it anyway. Remember what the backward look cost her. Remember that deliverance requires more than physical departure. It requires the sustained, deliberate orientation of everything you are toward what lies ahead rather than what lies behind. Remember Lot's wife. Abraham rose early that morning. He went to the place where he had stood before the Lord the evening before, the place of the negotiation, the place where he had drawn near and counted down from 50 to 10 and received a promise that 10 righteous souls would have been sufficient to hold back the fire. He looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah. He looked toward all the land of the plain. Genesis 19 verses 27 to 28. And he saw the smoke. And he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and beheld. And, lo, the smoke of the country went up as the smoke of a furnace. Genesis 19 verse 28, as the smoke of a furnace. The image is immense. Not a campfire, not the smoke of a burning building. The smoke of a furnace, a vast column of rising destruction visible from the hills of Mamre, from the place where Abraham had sat in the heat of the day and received his visitors and negotiated for the lives of people he did not know. He had started at 50. He had come down to 10, and there had not been 10. What Abraham felt in that moment, standing on the heights of Mamre, watching the smoke rise from the plain where 2 of the most prosperous cities of the ancient world had stood the evening before, Scripture does not directly record. It does not need to. The image itself is sufficient. A man who had argued for the righteous, who had drawn near to God on their behalf, who had pressed the negotiation as far as it could be pressed, standing in the morning light, watching the smoke of a furnace rise from a valley where his prayers had found no 10 people to rest upon. But Scripture adds one more sentence, one sentence that reframes everything. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Genesis 19 verse 29. God remembered Abraham, Lot's rescue, the angels at the gate, the hands laid on his arm in the moment of his lingering, The physical extraction from a city he could not leave on his own was not merely an act of mercy toward Lot himself. It was connected to something larger, to a relationship, to a covenant, to a man who had stood in the presence of God the evening before and asked, with full knowledge that the answer might be devastating, whether the righteous would be destroyed with the wicked. God had heard that question, and God remembered. This is the theological hinge on which the entire account turns. Because the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not, despite how it has sometimes been presented across the centuries, primarily a story about the nature of divine wrath. It is primarily a story about the nature of divine relationship, about what it means that God chooses to reveal his intentions to those he is in covenant with, about what it means that intercession, genuine, persistent, theologically grounded intercession, reaches the ear of the one who holds the fire. Abraham could not save Sodom. The count came up short. The negotiation ended where the city's own moral reality dictated it must end. But the relationship that produced the negotiation, the intimacy that caused God to ask himself whether to hide from Abraham what he was about to do, that relationship reached into the catastrophe and pulled one family out of it before the sky opened. Lot sat in Zoar, small and shaken and alive. His wife was a pillar of salt in the plain behind him. His sons-in-law were ash. 2 daughters sat beside him in a city he had not originally wanted. He had begged the angels to let him flee there instead of to the mountain, and they had granted his request. Genesis 19 verses 20 to 21. A small mercy within the larger mercy of survival itself. And the plain that had looked like Eden, the well-watered, prosperous, celebrated valley that had caught a young man's eyes when Abraham offered him first choice of the land, was smoke, rising into the morning sky of a world that would never look at those coordinates the same way again. 2 cities, gone before noon. The cry that had risen from them had been answered. But the answer raised questions that Abraham, and every reader since, has had to sit with in the silence that follows catastrophic divine judgment. Questions about justice, about mercy, about the precise relationship between the two, about what it means to live in a world governed by a God whose patience is not infinite, whose mercy is not unconditional, and whose judgment, when it finally falls, falls completely. The smoke was still rising, and somewhere in its gray columns, climbing into the morning sky above the valley that had been Eden and was now ash, was the answer to a question that every generation inherits from the one before it. How does a city arrive at the place where the sky opens against it? Not suddenly. Never suddenly. A city does not fall in a single night. It falls across 1,000 smaller decisions, across 100 compromises that each seem, in the moment of their making, too minor to matter, across a generation that inherits the normalized wreckage of the generation before it and builds upon that foundation without questioning what lies beneath. Sodom did not become Sodom overnight. It became Sodom the way all broken things become what they are, gradually, incrementally, one accommodation at a time, until the accumulation reached a weight that the mercy of heaven could no longer carry. Scripture does not leave the nature of Sodom's sin to speculation. It addresses it directly, not only in Genesis, but across multiple books of the Bible, each adding a layer of understanding to what made those cities' cry rise so unbearably to heaven. The prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after the destruction, delivers perhaps the most comprehensive biblical diagnosis of Sodom's condition. And what he says has surprised readers across every generation that has encountered it. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16 verse 49. Pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness, neglect of the poor and needy. Before the violence that surrounded Lot's house that final night, before the most visible and dramatic expression of Sodom's moral collapse, there was a foundation of prosperity so complete that it had curdled into entitlement, of abundance so total that it had produced not gratitude but indifference, of idleness so pervasive that it had created the conditions in which the darkest human impulses flourish unchecked. Sodom was not poor. Sodom was not desperate. Sodom was wealthy, comfortable, and utterly consumed by itself. And within that consumption, Within that closed loop of self-referential prosperity that had no upward orientation and no outward compassion, something had grown. Something that expressed itself most nakedly on the night the angels arrived. The crowd outside Lot's door was not the beginning of Sodom's story. It was the end of it. The final, unambiguous declaration of what a city becomes when it has spent enough generations turning away from accountability to anything beyond its own appetite. The book of Jude, in the New Testament, adds another dimension. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Jude 1 verse 7, set forth for an example. The destruction was not only judgment, it was instruction. A permanent, visible, geologically embedded lesson written into the landscape of the ancient world for every subsequent civilization that would pass through or hear of it. But here is what must be said carefully, and with the full weight of biblical theology behind it. The example Sodom sets is not narrowly about one category of sin. The biblical witness, taken in its totality, presents Sodom as the culmination of a comprehensive moral collapse. Pride that refused accountability. Prosperity that produced cruelty rather than generosity. Power that turned predatory toward the vulnerable. A community so thoroughly given over to its own appetites that the arrival of strangers, human beings deserving of the most basic protection of ancient hospitality law, became an occasion for collective violence rather than welcome. This is what made the cry rise to heaven. Not one night of one crowd outside one door. A sustained, systemic, generational rejection of every principle of human dignity and divine order, until the city itself had become an instrument of suffering for the vulnerable within and around it. Until the cry of those it had consumed reached a pitch that heaven could no longer absorb. And yet, even then, God went down to see. I will go down now, and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it. Genesis 18 verse 21. Even at the threshold of judgment, the divine movement was toward verification rather than assumption, toward seeing rather than presuming. The God of Abraham does not destroy on reputation alone. He goes down. He looks. He sends angels into the city at evening to assess what is actually there. What they found, the full population of the city, old and young, surrounding a house in the dark, answered the question that the negotiation at Mamre had left open. Were there 10? The city itself answered. There were not 10. But Lot was there. Flawed, lingering, compromised, morally inconsistent Lot. Sitting at the gate of a city he should have left years before, offering hospitality in a place that had forgotten what hospitality meant, making desperate and terrible choices in the darkness outside his own door in a frantic attempt to protect people he had invited under his roof. Lot was there, and God saw him. This is the grace that runs like a quiet river beneath the catastrophic surface of the Sodom narrative. That in a city where the count could not reach 10, where the entirety of the population could be mobilized on a single night toward a single act of collective darkness, God still found one man worth extracting, one family worth pulling out by the hand, one household that, however imperfectly, however inconsistently, however burdened by years of accommodation to a culture it had never fully separated from, still recognized the angels when they arrived, still opened a door, still set food before strangers, still tried, however inadequately, to stand between its guests and the crowd outside. Grace does not wait for perfection before it acts. It acts on the slender thread of whatever genuine orientation toward the good remains. And in Lot, in his rushed hospitality, in his persistent urging of the visitors to come inside, in his willingness to stand at his own door and face a hostile crowd, there was enough of that orientation to make God remember Abraham and send the angels to his gate before the fire fell. The New Testament confirms this reading in a passage that has startled many readers who come to it expecting a straightforward condemnation. The Apostle Peter, writing about God's pattern of rescuing the righteous from judgment while reserving punishment for the wicked, uses Lot as one of his primary examples. And delivered just Lot, vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them, in seeing and hearing, vexed his righteous soul from day to day with their unlawful deeds. 2 Peter 2 verses 7-8. Just Lot, righteous Lot, vexed. The word Peter chooses is significant. It means worn down, tormented, ground against. Lot was not comfortable in Sodom. He was not thriving in Sodom. He was being slowly abraded by it, his soul registering the wrongness of what surrounded him even when his feet would not carry him away from it. He saw, he heard, and what he saw and heard war against him daily like stone against stone. This is the portrait of a man caught in one of the oldest human traps, the trap of being too embedded in a place to leave it, too aware of its wrongness to be at peace within it. A man whose soul had never fully made peace with Sodom even as his life had become thoroughly entangled in it. And it was precisely this sustained, daily, unresolved grief at what surrounded him, that Peter points to as evidence of his righteousness. Not perfection, not consistent moral clarity, not the courage to stand up and leave when leaving was still possible without angelic intervention. Simply, a soul that could not make peace with darkness, that went on being vexed by it, day after day, year after year, until the angels came. God delivered him, not because he had earned it by the quality of his choices, but because he had never fully surrendered the part of himself that knew the difference between light and darkness, even while living in a city that had abandoned that distinction entirely. The smoke was still rising over the plain when Lot reached Zoar, still rising when Abraham stood on the heights of Mamre and looked toward what had been, still rising, Scripture implies, long after both men had turned their faces away from it and tried to understand what they had witnessed and survived. And in that rising smoke was a question that refused to stay in the ancient past where it might be safely contained. A question that followed the story out of Genesis and into every subsequent generation that inherited it. A question not about Sodom, but about the nature of the world Sodom inhabited, the world every human civilization inhabits. What does prosperity do to a people when it is not anchored in something beyond itself? What does abundance produce when it has no upward orientation, no gratitude, no accountability, no recognition that what has been received carries with it a responsibility toward those who have received less? What happens to a community when the vulnerable within it have no protection, when the stranger at the gate finds not hospitality but predation, when the poor find not generosity but indifference, when the cry of the suffering rises not to the compassion of neighbors, but into the uncaring air of a city too comfortable to hear it? Sodom answers these questions, not abstractly, not theoretically, with fire, with smoke, with a pillar of salt standing in the plain where a woman could not release what God had condemned, with two cities that had been the envy of the ancient world, well-watered, prosperous, positioned in the most fertile valley of the region, reduced to ash before the morning was fully established. The earth remembered what happened there. The landscape of that region carries the memory in its geology, in its sulfur deposits, in its desolation, in the quality of the air above the water that fills the valley where those cities once stood. The Dead Sea does not sustain life. Nothing grows on its shores without deliberate human cultivation. The land itself seems to carry the memory of a morning when the sky opened and what fell from it was not rain. But the story was not finished, because Lot, extracted from the catastrophe by angels who held his hand when his own feet would not move, was sitting in Zoar, alive, shaken to his foundations, grieving in ways that Scripture does not fully record, but that the imagination of every reader has filled in across thousands of years of engagement with this text. And what happened next? In the aftermath of survival, in the shadow of catastrophe, in the disorientation of a man who had lost everything except his daughters and his life, would add one more layer to a story that had already asked more of its readers than most stories dare to attempt. The fire had fallen, the smoke was rising, and the man God had remembered, because of Abraham, because of covenant, because of a negotiation conducted in the afternoon light of Mamre, was trying to figure out how to live in a world where everything he had built had been consumed before breakfast. Survival, it turns out, is only the beginning of the story. What comes after survival, how a rescued person rebuilds, or fails to rebuild, in the aftermath of divine intervention, is where the most searching questions about human nature finally surface. And Lot was about to discover that escaping the fire was easier than escaping what the fire had done to him. The fire was behind him. The city was ash, and Lot was afraid. Scripture records it simply, without psychological elaboration, in the way that the most honest accounts of human experience always do. And Lot went up out of Zoar, and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. Genesis 19 verse 30. He had begged the angels to let him flee to Zoar instead of the mountain. He had called it a little city, insignificant, harmless, surely acceptable as a refuge. The angels had granted his request. They had held the fire until he arrived there safely. Genesis 19 verse 22. And now, sitting inside the refuge he had bargained for, surrounded by the evidence of his own survival, he was afraid to stay in it. This is the psychology of trauma written into sacred text with uncomfortable precision. The man who could not leave Sodom voluntarily, who had to be pulled out by angelic hands while he lingered at the threshold of his own deliverance, now could not stay in the place of his rescue. The ground beneath him felt unstable. Every city felt like Sodom now. Every wall felt like a wall that might not stand. The very concept of dwelling in a place, of building a life within structures, within communities, within the ordinary geography of human settlement, had been shattered by a morning in which 2 of the most established cities in the region had ceased to exist before noon. He went to the mountain. He found a cave, and he lived there with his 2 daughters. The world they had known reduced to a cave in the hills above a plain of ash. The future they had imagined dissolved in the same fire that had consumed everything else. What followed in that cave is one of the most difficult passages in the book of Genesis. A passage that the Bible records without flinching, without softening, without inserting a divine intervention that prevents what happens from happening. Lot's daughters, isolated in the aftermath of total catastrophe, convinced that the destruction they had witnessed was global rather than local, that there was no man left on the earth to continue human life through them, made decisions born of desperation and distorted by grief that Scripture records as the origin of 2 nations. Genesis 19 verses 31 to 38. The text does not celebrate what happened. It does not condemn it with explicit editorial commentary either. It simply records it, the way the Bible consistently records the full, unvarnished complexity of human behavior in the aftermath of trauma, and allows the reader to sit with the discomfort of a story that refuses to resolve into easy moral categories. What it does show, unmistakably, across the full arc of the Sodom narrative, is the cost of the choices that preceded the catastrophe. The cost of Lot's decision to pitch his tent towards Sodom when Abraham offered him first choice of the land. The cost of years of accommodation to a culture that had normalized the unacceptable. The cost of sitting at the gate of a city whose cry had reached heaven, building a life in a place whose foundations were already condemned. The fire took the cities. But the aftermath, the cave, the daughters, the isolation, the distorted decisions made in the shadow of total loss. These were the costs that the fire did not take. These were the costs that survival carried forward. And yet God remembered Abraham. And yet the angels came to the gate before the fire fell. And yet hands were laid on Lot's arm in the moment of his lingering. And yet mercy moved before judgment descended. This is the tension that the Sodom narrative refuses to resolve, and that refusal is itself the most honest thing about it. Because the world in which Sodom burned is the same world in which Abraham negotiated at the gate of heaven. The world in which fire fell on the wicked is the same world in which mercy reached into the catastrophe and pulled one family out by the hand. These are not 2 different theological systems in conflict. They are 2 aspects of the same God, the God whose justice cannot permanently absorb the cry of the suffering, and whose mercy cannot abandon the one righteous soul still oriented, however imperfectly, toward the light. The smoke that Abraham saw rising from the plain that morning was not the final word of the story. It was the most visible word, the most dramatic, the most impossible to ignore. But beneath it, quieter and more enduring, was the word spoken at Mamre the evening before. The word of a God who asked himself whether to hide from his friend what he was about to do. The word of a relationship so intimate that divine judgment was preceded by divine disclosure, by an invitation to draw near, to ask, to negotiate, to press the question of justice and mercy to its furthest possible limit. Abraham had pressed it to 10, and there had not been 10, but there had been 1, and 1 was enough, not to save the city, but to be saved from it. This is the truth that the Sodom narrative deposits into the conscience of every reader who carries it forward out of Genesis and into the world they actually inhabit. Not the fire, not the sulfur, not the pillar of salt standing in the plain as a monument to backward longing. The truth beneath all of those, the truth that makes the story matter beyond its historical and geographical particularity, is this: God sees the cry of the suffering. He does not see it and immediately act. The patience of heaven operates on a timescale that human urgency finds agonizing. But he sees it. He hears it. He goes down to verify what has been reported. And when the cup of human cruelty has been filled to the measure that his justice requires, when the count cannot reach 10, when the entire population of a city mobilizes in the dark against the vulnerable, the response that comes is proportionate, complete, and irreversible. But before it comes, always before it comes, there is Abraham, standing between heaven and earth, drawing near, asking the question that covenant relationship makes possible. Not, will you destroy the city? But, will you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Will the judge of all the earth not do right? Genesis 18, verse 25. The judge of all the earth will do right. That is the answer the narrative gives, not in words, but in the structure of everything that follows. Justice fell on Sodom. Mercy reached Lot. Abraham stood on the heights of Mamre and watched the smoke rise from a plain where 10 righteous people had not been found. And the God who had disclosed his intentions to Abraham beforehand was the same God who had sent angels to pull one lingering, flawed, morally complicated man out of the catastrophe before it fell. Right was done, completely, in both directions simultaneously. Thousands of years after the smoke rose over the cities of the plain, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah continues to be told. It is told in synagogues and cathedrals and Orthodox churches and small congregations meeting in languages that did not exist when the fire fell. It is referenced in the New Testament by Jesus himself, not as a distant curiosity, but as a living warning, a present reality, a story whose relevance had not diminished by 1 degree across the centuries between its occurrence and his reference to it. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Luke 17 verses 29 to 30. Even thus, the pattern holds. The day comes without announcement, ordinary life proceeding in its ordinary rhythms until the moment it does not. Eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, building, and then the fire. And then the question of where you were standing when it fell. And then the devastating, irreversible importance of the direction your face was pointed in the moment of departure. Remember Lot's wife, the plain that had looked like Eden, the well-watered valley that had caught a young man's eyes when the whole land lay before him, and he lifted his gaze and chose. The city gate where a man sat in the heat of civic life, embedded in a community whose foundations were already crumbling beneath the weight of its own accumulated darkness. The door of a house where angels stood and a crowd gathered, and the full moral reality of 2 cities expressed itself in a single night. And above all of it, before all of it, a tent by the oaks of Mamre. 3 visitors appearing in the heat of the day, a man who ran to meet them, a feast prepared with urgency, a conversation that moved from the promise of impossible new life to the negotiation over the fate of cities that had forgotten what life was for. This is the geography of the Sodom story. Not only the plain of the Jordan, not only the coordinates of catastrophe, but the tent at Mamre, the place of relationship, of disclosure, of the divine intimacy that makes intercession possible. The place where a man drew near and asked the hardest question faith has ever asked of its God. Will the judge of all the earth do right? The smoke that rose from the cities of the plain on that morning was the answer, written in fire across the sky of the ancient world, preserved in the oldest sacred text humanity has inherited, carried forward across every generation that has read it and felt, in the reading, the weight of a question that has never stopped being asked. Because the cities that fill our world today are not Sodom, but they are built by the same human hands, inhabited by the same human hearts, subject to the same divine attention, the same hearing of cries, the same going down to see, the same counting of the righteous within the walls. And somewhere, in every generation, there is an Abraham, standing between heaven and earth, drawing near when wisdom might counsel distance, pressing the question of mercy when judgment has already been announced, not because the negotiation will always produce the outcome the intercessor hopes for, but because the God who asked himself whether to hide his intentions from his friend is still the God who discloses, who invites, who listens to the one who draws near with the audacity of covenant relationship and asks, even now, even here, even for this, will you not do right? The smoke has long since cleared from the plain of the Jordan. The cities are ash and memory and the geological testimony of a landscape that has never fully recovered from a morning when the sky opened. But the God who sent the fire and pulled Lot out by the hand and stood in conversation with Abraham until the sun moved across the sky of Mamre, that God has not changed. He still hears the cry. He still goes down to see. He still remembers those in covenant with him when the judgment falls. He still lays his hand on the arm of the lingering, the flawed, the compromised, the too embedded to leave on their own, and pulls them toward the door before the fire descends. And he still asks, in every generation, the question he asked beside a burning bush and answered beside a divided sea and rode in smoke above the cities of the plain. Is anything too hard for the Lord? The plain gives its answer in ash and silence. The sea gave its answer in walls of water and a morning without Egypt's army. And somewhere, in the tent of every human heart still oriented, however imperfectly, toward the light, the answer goes on being given. Nothing is too hard. Not even this.